From the creators of Off the Record, one of the most exclusive, invite-only events for revenue leaders, GetAccept is now bringing these conversations and insights on the record. This is the podcast where revenue leaders share their biggest challenges and how they overcame them. And here's your host, Morgan Ingram.
Hey everyone, Morgan J. Ingram here with another episode of On the Record podcast, where we unpack the real challengers from real sales leaders. And I'm excited to share my conversation that I had here today with Jonathon, the VP of Sales at Cognism, and he's been there for the past 7 years, taking them from seed stage to a successful international expansion. So you're going to want to hear what he has to say. And in this episode, these main 3 things he talks about is how to be super transparent with your team as you build, how to make sure as you're building across the different countries, you find the right regional leaders. Very niche conversation, or niche, whatever you want to call it. So that was pretty cool. And why the obvious choice isn't always the best one. So I can't say exactly what that means. So you're going to have to check out the episode on how he's elevating people to top performers to hit 150 to 160% of their target. So if you're thinking about international expansion, you've been figuring out how to grow the team, this is the episode for you. Jonathon, it's good to see you again. And how we start this podcast is we always go into a question that you know, have some fun facts before we get into the sales bit. So the first question that I have here for you is, what is your favorite country to visit and why?
That is a really good question. I love being in the hustle and bustle of a city. I'm based in London, which for New York, for Americans, it's comparable to New York, right? So,
yep.
I suppose my favorite city to visit. I love food, so it has to be Istanbul. It's like a very, very busy city, brilliant food, and it reminds me of London, but just with a complete twist. So,
okay, okay, so you go back like once a year? This sounds like it's a staple.
I go there I'm actually going there next week, so yeah, I go there. I like.
You can't get away.
Yeah, I love red meat, and they just have the best steak. So yeah, cool. That is my favorite place.
I love steak, so it sounds like I need to go to Istanbul. That's what you're telling me.
I'm Salt Bay's there. There's some I don't know if you have Salt Bay in the States.
We do.
There's a little steak. Yeah, it's very strong. So it's loads of good restaurants there for sure.
All right, cool. So that's what we're gonna check out next. We're gonna go to Istanbul, but let's get to it. So on this pod, on the record, our whole goal is to unpack challenges that you've had as a sales leader, to give transparent conversations, and then figure out how did you overcome that. So the first thing that we want to talk about is, what was your biggest challenge, and then we'll unpack it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I gave a little bit of thought to this. So just for context, I've been at Cognism 7 years. So joined when we're at kind of seed stages and IC, and then joined the leadership team as we kind of scaled operations. And I think one of the challenges that I've kind of seen firsthand is scaling internationally. That's, I think, for most US businesses now, there's saturation point in SaaS, and businesses are having to look outside their core markets. And I think at Cognism, because we're HQs based in Europe, that's always been core to our philosophy, is expanding our reach in Europe. So yeah, there was lots of lessons there in terms of how we built the team, where we done it, and I think now we've got a pretty good playbook that we can roll out and actually get success when we place people in operations on the ground.
Well, before we go into talking about a little bit more, when we were looking to expand internationally, what was a challenge that you faced in that you didn't expect to face, that was wow, you were very surprised by?
I think it's a really good question. The key one I would say is kind of the core. For me, the biggest challenge that we've always had was finding that core person to kind of lead the region. I think that I had a preconception, and I think our entire kind of C-suite did as well when we kind of set this up, that the type of individual that would be successful in that would be and established, straight out of a large corp, and kind of plug and play, and then they'll be able to implement that. So yeah, when we set up like Germany as an example, like the first hire that we made was a very, very established sales leader that was in a very big corporate, and like obviously we'll go into the lessons later, but they're like that necessarily wasn't the person that we needed to kind of build that operation from ground zero. So yeah, I think that's probably the absolute biggest one, was like finding that right person initially. That's been half the art of actually making the success of the region.
How do you make sure you pick the right person? Is there a criteria or a framework you have that you can share with other people?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a very good system in this now. So I imagine if you're like a Series B, Series C company, like you've got international inbounds that are coming in.
Yeah.
So what we tend to do is we tend to start on the marketing front. So we start deploying spend in these regions, and then we funnel that into our HQ, which is based in London.
Okay.
And then based on the conversions that we see there, that's when we test, we add a little bit more spend, and we see what the appetite is and what the conversion is. And when we actually get to a suitable number, that's when we actually start deploying our first people on the ground. And we always start with quite a skinny team when we push out. So for example, we're building out APAC at the moment. We've got one rep based out there who, with the view to lead the team, but we start in a very, very small confined team. Usually, and this is best practice, we always hire in two. But for APAC, we've done it a little bit different, and I'll go into why it's probably a little bit different why we've done APAC. But yeah, like hire in twos, and that's really the success that we've seen, like when we kick off.
Yeah, let's talk about the expanding internationally into APAC, because APAC there's just so many different things that are going on there. Like, what were some challenges you faced? Like, when you're like, okay, we want to go to APAC, like there's a lot of different ways on how you can do that. What were some things you were like, okay, like you learned along the way of what not to do?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, APAC we set up around 2 months ago. We had a high proportion of revenue. We had a couple of $1 million going into our core team, so we knew that we had sufficient inbound to put a rep out there. What we done, because of the time zone difference, I think for you guys in the States, it's even more wonky than what it is for us in the UK. But like we actually moved someone from our HQ. It was an old high performing account executive that we moved out there, and he's gone out there with the view to kind of grow that team. And like I can give you some context on that as well. So with our French team, we actually took one of our top enterprise account executives, French speaking, moved them out there, and that team to date has been our highest performing team globally. They're doing about 150-160%.
Okay, nice.
And I think when you set up these new offices, like that culture and that work ethic and product knowledge, like I've seen the best thing to do is take that from your internal HQ, move that out there, and get that team humming. And I think just generally through my career as well, like they might not necessarily be the person that can grow that team to 50 reps, but when that point comes, like you can hire above them, they can learn, and then naturally as time goes on, they either leave the business and go flourish elsewhere, or they take that role and they grow that team then. So that's really what we've seen, is taking very high exceptional talent, giving them that opportunity, and then watching them succeed.
Yeah, I mean that's the key, right? So one thing you mentioned is like the challenges of time zones. When you're looking to expand internationally, is probably where, you know, we just talked about it. You have to travel, you have to go certain places. How do you, maybe the best word is balance that, because I don't think it really isn't a balance though, to be fair. Yeah. So that's, I'm like, it's not a balance, but how do you like manage that, right? Because okay, we want to expand internationally, but there obviously is time zones. There's probably staying up later, but like you have to make sure you set the right expectations with your current team and let them know like, hey, things are going to be different. Like, how are you managing that? Yeah,
so I think the key thing is making sure you've got very, very good leadership that sits in those regions.
Of course.
Like they need to be relatively self-sufficient, and I think that's really where we've seen success of like taking our very, very good core people and putting them in there, so that they know the core infrastructure, they know the plays that we do, and they know the cadences that they need to run. From my perspective, like managing them, like APAC's very different. I'm still trying to struggle with this one because it's just so different. Like, calls are starting like 8 o'clock, and the benefit is that I know I have real trust in the individual, so it's not like we need constant Slack communication. Like it's very much short, condensed calls that we have, where it's very focused on like top level strategy, and then they execute on that. But like our European teams, like I try and get out to them every 2 months. And I think once you're in Central Europe, it's super easy. Like you can get the train across, and it's within like 2 hours for us to do that. So and then obviously I need to make sure that like we've got very good leadership back in HQ. So if I'm out, like I know that the ship's just humming from the SDR function and the AE function. But yeah, we try to be quite tactical. If we're hiring key roles out in those regions, that's typically when I would go out there and try and assist with that. Or it's on that kind of 2-month cadence.
So one thing that you mentioned there is like you're traveling, you're getting in front of people, you're being active, and all those different things. But I want to actually take a step back, because some people listening in are like, okay, you scaled internationally, but why? What was the reason that you decided to scale internationally? Why did you go APAC? Is there a certain number that you hit that you were like, hey, we don't have like we've tapped out this market and now we're moving forward, or is it like we're about to tap out, let's make that move? Like, how's a leader, how are you making that decision to decide we're going to go to this region now?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think in today's world, it's all based on like output. Like what output can we get for the dollars that we put in, right? And I think there's been a big shift for us as well. And I think just generally for SaaS is the key metric that everyone's focused on now is like your NDR and GDR, right? So for us, it's really finding like what segments of the market and what countries can we actually get very good return for spend. And I think if we look, example in the States, right, like we know that the salary bands in the States are crazy, CAC's very expensive, and like the competitive landscape's also very hard, right? So I think when we look at greenfield markets like Australia, France, Germany, and other areas in Central Europe, we know that there's very low competitive, like it's not saturated. Like we've got first mover advantage there, and I think as an organisation, one of our key benefits is that we're known as an international data provider, right? So leaning into that a little bit more and actually having that in the market is a real distinction for us when we go head to head with some of the big US players. So yeah, that's really my view. Like greenfield versus competitive, like we generally have a much higher win rate when we enter new regions. Very different sell. Like we're selling our concept and our product for the first time to a lot of these people, whereas in the stateside, like most people have an incumbent, right? So it's more rip and replace. So there's a different skill set that's required from the rep and actual business cases that need to be formed. But it's a really exciting time when you get it humming and working.
Yeah, so actually this is where I've heard this a lot when I've gone and trained teams, is that we know that obviously same company, but based on what region you're in, it could feel like a completely different company and team, right? Based on where you're at. So how are you making sure as a leader that you still have like the Cognism ethos and mindset across all these different regions, but still allow them to do what they need to do because it's different?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the way that we've structured it at Cognism is we have like a global SDR leader. So they're responsible for the general outline of like how the SDR function operates. Like
so they never sleep.
Huh?
So they never sleep.
Yeah, like there's stuff cool, right?
You're just on it. You're just on it.
They're paid good bucks. No, so they do like the general. They do like the top line strategy that sits behind the SDR function. Then we have regional SDR leaders that sit in the Pacific region. So they're given autonomy to be flexible and in their approach of how they go to market. And then for the AE team, again, we have like our regional heads that again are all different. So like you have to give the autonomy to each region to have their own way of doing things. And I think that's probably one of my biggest lessons is like, particularly like France as an example, it's very hierarchical. Like you need to build the rapport lower level, up, and you cannot break that system. It's just how French people purchase. And whereas like the US and UK is just very different to that. So like yeah, you need to have trust in your leadership that when they roll something that like they're doing it for the right reasons, and it's just a cultural nuance. Like to be honest, like Morgan, like we just coming out the back of summer. Like for me, like it was our first time in France that we had like a French selling season, and like I heard that it was like dead, but it really is like
What?
the whole country just shuts down. So it's like there's some real nuances, like how you do your planning and how you do your forecasting, right? Like next year we're going to readjust our forecast probably and put more weighting into September than we are into August, because like the data just doesn't support, and there's not enough people in August to justify a high target.
Yeah, it's even the same with Japan.
Yeah.
And selling and even prospecting there is a whole different thing. Like it actually is like there's a whole different playbook that I didn't know existed. So like to your point, it's like yeah, you can have these best practices that you and your company believe in, but then you also have to know what the region is doing too, because it could be something that you just haven't heard before. You're like, wait, that's how y'all do it, and it's like, yeah, that's literally how it is. Like,
Yeah, that's true.
you gotta know. You just gotta know.
That'd be amazing selling in Japan. Wow. I can't. I want to have a separate conversation with you on that. That sounds.
Look, the whole breakdown that this person gave me on how they have to do things, I was like, yeah, I have none of the things I'm going to tell you probably aren't going to work based on what you have to do. I was like, yeah, that's just so different. But you have to obviously know that at the end of the day. So, okay, you have the team. If you had to look at all these things that we're talking about, you have the team in multiple different places. You have APAC. You all started in London, so you have your team in the States as well. That's the international expansion for you too. What are 3 things that, as leaders are listening in, they want to make an international move to wherever they're going to do? What are the 3 things that they absolutely need to do and check off and talk to their executive team about before they make this expansion?
That's a really, really good question. I think the first one is like getting the commitment from the business. Like that's so critical. Like you cannot just land in a region and expect success just because you've deployed salespeople there. I think we've seen this firsthand when we've like launched in France and Germany. Like the language nuance that you need, like the collateral from like product marketing, the competitive landscape that's out there. Like you need product marketing sales as a free generally. Like you need them all humming, and then also making sure that you've got allocated resources and spend to support that. The other thing as well is like we've done this as when we first started as well. Like we just deployed salespeople, and then customer signed, and then post sale they're reverting back into HQ on a ridiculous time zone or different language. So like you need to really think about the whole customer journey, and make sure that you've got resources that cater to all of that. The second thing is like you need to put, actually the second one is kind of what I alluded to earlier, make sure that you bring that culture and uniqueness about your company to that region. So my personal view now is always bring like someone from our core team over there for a set period of time if you can't move someone out there permanently,
Right.
Because you need that core base. And then the third one is like if you are setting up international, like make sure you got a cadence to go out there. Like I think Germans in general are very, very skeptical. This is what we saw. So like we were doing a lot of like Zoom calls with them to like sell ourselves when we took over. And I think until you actually meet face to face and actually get that buy-in, like it was very difficult for us to get buy-in from the team before we actually, particularly in Germany, like we spent a lot of time out there getting the reps bought into it, getting them bought into the vision, and that, so make sure you allocate time if you are going to set up international offices.
I agree with that cadence, because it's easy to get excited for 3 months and go out there and then completely lead that team astray, and then they feel like they're on an island. Then like that's the last thing that you want to do, because they don't feel like they're a part of anything, and that's like obviously the biggest miss that you can have at the end of the day. And so kind of talking about your own personal growth as we wrap up here, like what are things that you learned as a leader, and how did you have to evolve and grow as you were looking and talking to these other regions?
I think one thing for me that was like because if you look at it on the grand scale of things, like the new regions that we're setting up as a proportion of revenue, like that we're actually generating, it's very, very small. So I think that's one thing as a leader that I've had to adapt on, is like, again, putting focus on where our biggest revenue is, because that's going to determine our quarter. But like, you can't view everything as apples to apples. Like, you need to spend the time with the regions to grow them, and that might not create a huge gain initially, but like, you're building the foundations for you to be able to scale that.
Right.
So yeah, I think that was one. Then like also for me, I think I put a lot more autonomy, or I've given a lot more autonomy to my leaders, I think, as I've scaled international, because like, you can't have control of everything when you get to a certain size, and you need to make sure that you've got the right people. So I think spending a lot of time in that hiring process, like, do not rush that first hire, like, absolutely not. Like, we have 4 or 5 of our senior leadership team involved in the process when we hire in new regions, because it's such a critical component if you're not there all the time. So yeah, I would say that's my key points.
One thing I want to ask there is that you want to make sure you hire the right people. We talked about making sure you have the right person, right, as well, when you have in the region. Is there a set of question or a question that you ask to determine if someone truly is a good fit for you all?
So we, like, in these instances, we run a lot of scenario-based questions. So we take a lot of, like, we do a lot of case study presentation when we go into interviews. I hate 30, 60, 90s. I think they're...
it's just like, okay, like, what are we going to do with this?
No one holds them to account, and it's like the same shit, right? Like, it's like 30 days I'm going to observe, and then it's like, it's rubbish. So, like, we like to give them, like, real examples. So we give them, like, walk me through, like, your hiring strategy of how you'd hire your first AE. Walk me through, like, a training program that you'd run, and we'll give them an example, and then they have to build the training material to sit alongside that. So, like, we try and take the day-to-day operation of what is expected and get them to start thinking about that, and that gives us a really good gauge of the kind of character that they are. The one thing as well that I love is, like, because we take most of these people internal, like, we know their work ethic, we know what they're like in a team environment, so it's a little bit less risk for us. But like, our UK guy that we just hired recently, when I took the global role, he came in and he was external. Like, again, it was very scenario based, and that he's absolutely excelling now. So I think that for us is how we do our big leadership hires.
No, I love that. And as we do wrap up here and towards the end, Jonathon, any lasting piece of advice you give to people as they're looking to expand internationally? Maybe they're concerned, they're worried. What relief advice would you give them here?
Yeah, I think, like, make sure you do your due diligence before you go. Like, I think when we set up Germany as an example, right? Like, we didn't really look into, like, we sell contact data, so we didn't really do the project plan that sat around it, which was like, what's the legal basis for us to go here? Like, how does the team operate? How's it structured? And this is not just sales, right? This is just general. But, like, we found out a year in that a German team can create a workers' council, and if they create a workers' council, every single promotion has to go through that council, and they can hold everything up. So, like, just make sure if you are building operations on the ground that you really understand, like, the laws that sit there, like, because that can really hold back, and it can be really difficult as you scale there.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Didn't even know that existed. So it's good. I guess it's good to know that people now have some insight that they didn't know about, right?
Yeah, I think actually there's one more thing that I think is super, super important as well. Like, where you set up base, like, it's so important. So in Cologne, in Germany, when we set up in Cologne, and I doubt, do you know Cologne, Morgan?
No, I know. I've never been there, but I know what it is.
Okay, yeah. All right, that's just a start, right? Like, I didn't even know that was like a place where you'd build a tech company, right? But we had the leader at the time was based in Cologne, so we set up office in Cologne, and then everything after that is then based in Cologne. And Cologne is such a difficult place to hire because it's not a tech scene. So I think, like, when you build internationally, this is a policy that we got now, is we build in the hub. So we're in Paris now. We got a team in Boston. We got a team in Sydney. So, like, don't build around an individual, like, build around a hub, because that's going to be core for you being able to scale that team.
Yep, I 100% agree with that. So, Jonathon, any shout outs or mentions you want to have before we get out of here?
Yeah, like I think like for my team, I think like Ben Mouquet has been absolutely amazing. Like look him up on LinkedIn. Like he's been like our superstar. He's gone from an SDR all the way now to lead in France, and he's got such a bright future at the company. So yeah, I think everyone in Cognism, hats off, doing great.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on, and everyone listening. Hopefully you take this advice and you can get the most out of it, and we'll see you all in the next time. And that wraps up another episode of On the Record podcast with my guest, Jonathan. And here are the key takeaways. 1, get full business commitment. You need marketing, customer support, customer success, all your resources, not just the sales team. And then you heard it here in the interview, build in tech hubs. Not around individuals, but around the hubs so you can have really good talent. Paris, Boston, London, those are places where you're going to have really good talent, and then you can build from there. And then export your culture through international talent, and that's where you're going to find the most successful moves and grow those top performers. So my hope is you have one of these takeaways written down, you're going to go execute on it, and thank you so much for tuning into the episode.